Okay, hi everyone. Today we are here with Mitt Winter, who is a sports law attorney at Kennyhertz Perry and is also a former Division I basketball player. So he's got a ton of experience in the college sports world. And today we're just going to be talking with him about all things NIL. So thanks so much for meeting with us today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
So to start off, can you just talk a little bit about how you got started in the NIL world and what sort of drew you in?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I was a former college basketball player. I played at William and Mary, and then I went out to law school at the University of San Francisco. And when I got out of law school, I was lucky enough to work at a law firm, and we started doing some college sports related stuff. So, funny enough, I represented the NCAA in some cases when I first got out of law school out there in San Francisco. One of which dealt with athlete compensation. It was sort of like a precursor case to the O'Bannon case and the Alston case and some of the ones that are pending now, called White versus NCAA. So that's kind of how I got started in the college sports legal world. And then when I moved to Kansas City, where I live now, I worked at a firm and we represented the Big 12 and Conference USA and all of their legal work, which was a wide variety of stuff. Worked on a lot of conference realignment stuff, TV contracts, and then also the O'Bannon case and the Alston case for those conferences. And then 2019 moved to my current firm, and that's kind of around the time when you could tell NIL was going to become a thing. The rules were going to change, and athletes were going to be able to start monetizing their NILs at some point in the near future. So I already had that background as a former college athlete and all the legal stuff I had previously worked on. So it was just like an easy transition into the NIL world. And it was something I was personally very interested in as well. So I really just started paying attention to, the state laws that were being passed and slated to go into effect. And then what the NCAA was doing from its perspective on drafting NIL legislation that would allow athletes to monetize their NILs. And then when July 1, 2021 hit and the rules did change, I was just, like I said, positioned well to kind of move into that world. And since then, I've done a lot of work in the NIL space and just college sports legal space in general. So I represent some universities, a number of NIL collectives, different businesses doing stuff in the NIL space. I've represented some athletes, some agents. So I've kind of seen it from all different perspectives.
Yeah, that's super cool. So you mentioned NIL collectives. A lot of things and all things NIL are very new to the college world, but can you talk a little bit about how NIL collectives have sort of taken over and what it how it's impacted the college recruiting world as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, money coming from NIL collectives right now is, a huge factor in recruiting, and it's not just football and basketball. It's lots of sports that people don't necessarily think that NIL would play a role. It definitely does play a role. So right now, about 80% of dollars flowing to college athletes via NIL is coming from collectives. So there's really two worlds of NIL. You have the collective world, which is where I've said most of that money flowing to athletes. And really the money coming from collectives is, even though the deals are written as NIL deals and the athletes are having to perform NIL related services to get paid, really they're being paid because they're good at their sport, and the collective wants the athletes to play for the school they're affiliated with. And then you have the other world of NIL, which a lot of people call true NIL, which is, your brand deal. So like Caitlin Clark in a State Farm commercial, stuff like that. A lot of people call that true NIL, and that's about 20% of dollars flowing to athletes. And it's sort of flipped on the number of activations. Like 80% of activations are true NIL, but 80% of the dollars flowing to athletes is coming from collectives. And so it's a very important part of recruiting when coaches are out talking to athletes. It's going to come up, more often than not. What kind of NIL program do you have? What kind of deals does your collective enter into with athletes? And so it's important for coaches to have that information available and talk about what the collectives do. And now, after an injunction that was entered in the Tennessee versus NCAA case, collectives can be out there talking to recruits and offering them specific NIL deals as an inducement to go to a specific school. Before that, there was an NCAA rule that said NIL deals could not be recruiting inducements. It wasn't always being followed. Collectives were out talking to recruits before when that was technically prohibited, but now that it's not prohibited at all, it's become, a more important factor with collectives out there offering specific deals to athletes, whether that's high school athletes or athletes that are in the transfer portal.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned sort of how it's sort of changed the recruiting world a lot. So when different schools have a ton of different resources available in terms of NIL, how do you think recruits should approach that? And how important do you think NIL should be to a recruit when they're trying to sort out which school they want to go to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to depend on the specific athlete or recruit and how important getting some NIL compensation is for them. For some, it's probably going to be not important at all. And for others, it might be pretty high up on their list. And if it's not number one, it might be number two. But I think for most either high school or athletes in the transfer portal, it's going to be on your list of factors. Mm-hmm. Whether it should be the number one factor, in my opinion, in most cases, probably not. But that's not to say it shouldn't be an important factor. And everybody's situation is different, and the financial, background they come from, it's different family background. But from my perspective, when you're going to a university to play a sport, there are other things like, am I going to be able to play right away, or am I going to have to wait for a while? Not that that's a bad thing either, but do I actually like going to this university? Do I like living in this city, or do I like the campus? Do I like the coaches? Do I like the teammates? NIL now has just become another factor thrown into all of those other factors that were already present before. And I don't think there are a ton of athletes that are making their decision just on who's going to pay me the most. But like I said, it is a factor now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if an athlete is sort of thinks that NIL is kind of high up on their list when they are going through the process, what sort of things should they look for in terms of a school? Like, what resources would they want a school to have to help them in their process?
Yeah, there are a lot of schools now that have in-house employees who just focus on NIL related things to help the athletes kind of navigate that process. Some have multiple employees that help with that, but there are still some that don't have any employees that are helping them with navigate NIL. So that's one thing that would be a consideration. Some schools also offer different types of programs where, let's say, an athlete's offered an NIL deal, whether that's from a collective or just from a brand, and they need some help reading the contract that they're offered, because most college athletes are not familiar with all the legalese that's in your typical NIL agreement. So there are some schools that have legal clinics where an athlete can go and have either a law student or a law professor review their agreement and kind of help them walk through it and talk about what's important and things they might want to go back to the person that offered them that deal and ask to change. So those are some of the important things. And then there are a lot of schools that offer different types of education programs on things like paying your taxes, financial literacy, social media, and branding, which can help with the NIL stuff as well.
Yeah, totally. So going off of the having someone help you look over the legal talk and making an NIL deal or something, how how hard is it for like just a regular athlete to be able to understand everything, and how common is it that maybe you might find yourself in a deal that you don't actually want to be in because you didn't sort of understand everything? Like, are there red flags that athletes might want to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, most college students in general are not going to be familiar with all the terms in a contract. I know when I was in college playing basketball, I wouldn't have had any clue what a lot of the stuff meant. And so I think it's really important to at least have someone that you trust, knows what they're talking about and is familiar with this stuff to review the agreement for you, just so they can at least spot some of those red flag things for you. And then you might need some more help after that, or you might feel comfortable then going back and talking with whoever offered you the deal. But there's lots of important things that could get an athlete into trouble with the deal that they sign. Not necessarily trouble with the NCAA or anything, but just long-term locking yourself into something you don't want to be locked into. Like, how long does the agreement last? What kind of intellectual property rights am I giving up? What is the business going to be able to do with my NIL? Do I have to approve things they do before they're able to do them? There are a number of different things like that athletes need to be on the lookout for before they actually sign an agreement. There are lots of cases where athletes just presented with a deal. They don't even read it. They don't have anyone else read it. They just sign it because they know they're going to get paid, which is nice. But like I said, if that's the case, you could be signing an agreement where you're giving up tons of rights that you wouldn't have to give up if you had someone else read it and help you maybe negotiate some of those terms.
Yeah, definitely. The money always sounds nice, but it's important to know what you're getting yourself into.
Yep.
So obviously the NIL world has impacted the recruiting world, but how would you, can you talk a little bit about how the NIL has affected the transfer portal?
Yeah, it's almost been like a perfect storm of the transfer portal and NIL colliding at the same time, kind of like coming into the world at the same time. And then also, in addition to the transfer portal, now athletes can transfer every year and play right away because of another court case, which is also added to that perfect storm, I would say. So because the transfer portal does exist and it's easy to go into the portal, and now it's easy to transfer and play right away, even if you've already transferred 2 or 3 times and play right away at your new school, it's almost created annual free agency in college athletics. And there are definitely some athletes who just go into the portal, kind of see, I want to see what kind of offers I'm going to get from some of these collectives, which, if their goal is to see how much money they can make, it's smart to do that. At the pro level, if athletes could become free agents every year, they'd probably do that as well. And so for a lot of college athletes, this is their best time to try and monetize their athletic talents. And so that's what's happening. So it's created a lot of athletes going into the portal, and then the NIL deals that are now being offered to them by collectives has just become a huge part of that transfer portal recruiting process.
Yeah, definitely. So I feel like the big deals that we see are always just the giant NIL deals that the top Power 5 athletes are getting. How do you see NIL entering into the smaller schools like D3, D2, NAIA, or JUCO? And do you think it's going to grow more in those areas as well?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely athletes at the D3, D2, NIA level that have NIL deals. There aren't as many collectives at that level, so there isn't as much of that activity, although there are collectives at that level for sure that I'm aware of, and there will probably be more of those coming online in the future. But even though there aren't as many collectives, there are still plenty of athletes that are getting NIL deals at that level. I think at that level, it's just a little bit more of trying to brand yourself and put yourself out there as someone who wants these types of deals might take a little more effort on the athlete's part. If you're not at one of the big P5 schools playing basketball or football or other sports that are on TV more. So I think at that level is more about building, a bigger social media platform. And there are, definitely some athletes that have done a really good job of that at that level.
Yeah, for sure. What would be your advice to anyone who are trying to get into the NIL world? What's something that they should know before they get into it?
Are you talking about if they want to work in the NIL space in the future, or?
Yes, or athletes who want to find NIL deals.
Gotcha. If you're talking about, like the true NIL brand deal type stuff, if it's good or bad, social media definitely plays a big part in that. So doing a good job of trying to build your brand and build a good social media platform for yourself, I think is important, and also engaging with the people that follow you on social media, because that's what a lot of the brands are looking for is, what kind of engagement do you have? You might have a lot of social media followers, but if there's no engagement, not going to be as attractive to some of those brands that might want to do deals with you. And then I would say from, if you're an athlete who's being offered different deals from collectives, I think it's important to have someone helping you navigate that world that's familiar with it, because generally you're going to be offered contracts, and some of the contracts can be pretty detailed and long. That's true of brand NIL deals as well. So, you don't necessarily need quote unquote agent, or you don't even need an attorney necessarily, but just someone who's familiar that can help you navigate that process. It could be a parent, it could be someone else that you trust. But I think that's probably a really important thing.
Yeah, for sure. I think the NIL world can be a little trickier than people think when you're starting to get into it. So to move on, recently the Dartmouth basketball team voted to unionize. Can you talk a little bit about, for those of us who don't know a lot about what that means in the law world, can you talk about what that means and how this might impact the future of the NCAA?
Yeah. So before the Dartmouth men's basketball players unionized, they had to be declared employees of the university. And so they had to file a petition with the National Labor Relations Board. And once they did that, the National Labor Relations Board regional office in Boston said, yes, Dartmouth men's basketball players, you are employees of the university based on our legal analysis. So once that happened, then that gave the basketball team the ability to vote to unionize. And as you mentioned, they held that vote a number of weeks ago, and they voted 13-2 in favor of unionizing. And so now they are represented by a pre-existing union up there in New Hampshire, where Dartmouth is. It's one of the service employees unions. So now that they are officially a union, it means that Dartmouth is supposed to collectively bargain, basically negotiate with the union and the players over the terms of their employment. So how much are they going to get paid? What are their working conditions going to be like? So for a college athlete, that would be like, when are you going to practice? How much are you going to practice? What are you going to do in the off season? What's your travel going to be like? What sort of like medical insurance and other benefits are you going to receive? So just like any other type of employer-employee relationship, when you have a job, those are the types of things that they are able to now negotiate over. Although Dartmouth has said, no, we don't think you're employees, even though the NLRB said that. We're not going to collectively bargain with you. So it's going to have to go through the legal process. They've appealed it to the the main NLRB board in Washington, D.C. From there, it's probably going to go into the federal court system. So it'll probably be a couple of years until we have like a final answer on whether some college athletes are going to be employees, at least based on the Dartmouth case. There is another similar case pending out in LA for USC athletes, and that one's for men's and women's basketball players and football players. So that's another one that it's probably going to turn out the same as the Dartmouth decision, and the NLRB will say, yes, these athletes are employees. The difference between that one is that one's also seeking a finding that the USC athletes are employees of the conference and the NCAA, which if the NLRB says, yes, you are employees of the conference and the NCAA, could have ramifications for lots of college athletes, because possibly then athletes at least all Division I men's and women's basketball players and FBS football players could be employees of the NCAA and their conferences as well. So that could, change things up a lot. But that ultimate question of whether at least some college athletes will be employees is probably, a number of years off, unless some conferences say, all right, we're just going to go ahead and say our athletes are employees. We're going to recognize you as employees, allow you to unionize, and then we're going to go ahead and collectively bargain with you, which is possible. But at least in the current environment now, probably not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the Dartmouth was able to do this directly with their school because they were a private institution, correct? So how can you talk a little bit about how those two cases are different, and what sort of what other schools would be able to do something similar to Dartmouth?
Yeah. So the NLRB, they have jurisdiction over private employers. And so, like you said, Dartmouth is a private university, so it's a private employer. For athletes at other private schools, since they're also under the jurisdiction of the NLRB, they could go through the same process that Dartmouth did, file a petition to unionize. Presumably the NLRB would say, yes, you're employees, and then they could vote to unionize. If you're an athlete at a public university, which obviously lots of universities are public, you're governed by state laws. And so some state laws don't allow public employees, which if you're an employee of a public university, if you're an athlete at a public university and you are an employee of that university, you would be governed by the state laws in that state. And some of them don't allow public employees to unionize.
Mm-hmm.
So where the USC case comes in, it's trying to get around that public-private issue by saying, all right, even if you're an athlete at a public university, if you are an employee of your conference or the NCAA, then you're still an employee of a private entity, since conferences and the NCAA are private entities, which would allow athletes at both private and public schools to go through that unionization process that Dartmouth already did.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. I don't know if this is a question you can answer, but a lot of this is happening, these court cases are happening now, and then there's just a lot of talk about whether athletes should be paid directly from their schools or from the NCAA or something like that. Why now is this all happening?
It's been just a long buildup, I would say, and there have been court cases that have kind of whittled away at the NCAA rules kind of over the last 10 years. The first one was the O'Bannon case, which said the NCAA rules that prohibit athletes from being paid for use of their NIL violated antitrust law. The rules didn't change at that time, but they eventually did with the state laws, and the NCAA was forced to change its rules. And then with the Alston case, which is the one that was at the Supreme Court in 2021, that the NCAA lost 9-0. That's been another big catalyst for change, because it basically called into question a lot of basically all of the NCAA rules that limit how much compensation athletes can be paid. Were called into question by that case. And so Once you had that, then there have been other cases that have been filed kind of building off of that. One is the House versus NCAA case, which it's seeking to allow schools to directly pay NIL compensation to their athletes, which is still prohibited by NCAA rules. And it's also seeking back pay for the NIL compensation that athletes were previously not able to be paid because of the old NCAA rules. So that one actually goes to trial in January of 2025. So that could change things up a lot. It might settle before then. And then there's another case that was recently filed called the Carter versus NCAA case by the same attorneys in the House versus NCAA case and the Alston versus NCAA case that's seeking to get rid of the NCAA rules that prevent college athletes from being paid for their athletic performance. So all these cases are just kind of like building off of each other. So kind of that's why we are where we are now with all these rules being called into question and the model changing the way it is.
Yeah, for sure. I've just been seeing like so many people talking about it now, and it seems like a huge topic of conversation. Okay, so sort of as a final question, can you talk a little bit about the services that you offer at Kennyhertz Perry, and how can athletes contact you if they have any questions?
Yeah, like I said, I've kind of done things from all different angles in the NIL world, so I'm very familiar with NIL agreements, whether that's collectives between collectives and athletes, or brands and athletes, or an agreement an athlete might enter into with an agent, which is also very, very important and often overlooked by athletes. They're excited. They're like, I have an agent. This guy's going to help me find NIL deals or help me navigate the process. But there's important things in that agreement that you want to look out for before you sign it as well, like how much of the money you bring in from your NIL deals might be going to the agent, which in some cases could be a lot. So I can help athletes navigate that and negotiate all of those types of agreements. Best way to reach out to me, I'm on Twitter, or X now, I guess, at Winter Sports Law. And my email address is mitt@kennyhertzperry.com. You can just find me online. If you Google my name, probably will pop up. But yeah, can help athletes in a number of ways.
Great. Yeah, I think that's it. Do you have any final things you want to share about anything NIL involved?
Just that, there's already been a lot of change, and over the next 6 months, year, 2 years, things are going to continue to change. So it's an ever evolving space. So if you're interested in NIL and just college sports in general, what the future is going to look like, there's a lot of stuff to keep up on and stay abreast of. So try and do your best you can with that. It's a lot of information at times, but there's pretty good resources out there on social media, or just reading different sports writers that keep up on this stuff a lot. So I'd recommend doing that.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your insight. It was super helpful. And yeah, thanks for talking with us today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.